DeFoe with us to kick off our Water Wednesdays. I'm Libby Bent, and I'm happy to be joined by my fellow board member, Andrea Krause, who is our co-host this evening. The St. Louis River Alliance is a membership organization that's committed to connecting people to the river as we work to restore and to protect it. And we welcome you to join us and become a member. We work on some pretty cool habitat projects like piping plover monitoring and wild rice planting. And it's heartening to see that after decades of neglect and industrial pollution, our fragile wild rice beds are slowly coming back. We collaborate with state, tribal, and federal agencies to help delist the St. Louis River as an area of concern. And we are really pleased to now be the managers of the St. Louis River Estuary National Water Trail. The estuary received this designation in 2020 by the US Secretary of the Interior, and it's really a celebration of a cleaner river, even as mercury and threats remain. So before I introduce Ricky, I want to acknowledge that this magnificent river and estuary that we love has been home to the Ojibwe people in the Dakota and Northern Cheyenne before them for millennia. A revered waterway, it holds great spiritual and personal significance for its original stewards, and we all benefit today from those who cared for the land and the air and the water. And we honor and respect them as custodians past and present. And we also respect the science and the knowledge that has been learned and passed down through thousands of years. So speaking of passing down knowledge, our speaker this evening, Ricky DeFoe, is a member of the Fond du Lac Band of Minnesota Chippewa and works as a language and curriculum specialist in Fond du Lac's Ojibwe language revitalization program. He's also volunteered and brought the Ojibwe language and culture into the Arrowhead Juvenile Center, the Northeast Regional Correctional Center, the St. Louis County Jail, and into hospitals and hospices in the community. Ricky's a graduate of a federal Indian boarding school, attended Flandreau Indian School in South Dakota, and he served in the US Army National Guard. He's a retired Union Journeyman Ironworker, pipe carrier, and sweat lodge keeper. He traveled to Honduras with Witness for Peace to observe firsthand the devastating effects of US foreign policy on Indigenous peoples and marginalized groups. So there's no one better, I think, to share their Indigenous world perspective with us this evening. So thank you so much for being here with us, Ricky.
You're welcome, Libby. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me clearly. I'm trying to utilize this Chromebook. I usually use my phone, which has been pretty trustworthy, but then I spilled some coffee on it, so then I kind of blurred out. So bear with me this evening, please. I feel extremely honored to be here this evening to be able to share some things that I've been taught about worldviews and things. First off, I want to lead out into some Ojibwe. So, Akoe ase maokea Anishinaabe. Apne Anishinaabe ogaganuna manito. Bamapi ninga niwia sa wa sema king jigatik. Chigagwe jimagwa ingil manito gwendani moknu danun. Giwita gamig gae. Gegit sa gichi ani gamin. Gichi Ojibwe gamin. Iwete. Miko gae inapiteni mag sago ingil awesian yag akene gigun yagima. Misogo atsu kanik miswe. Nashkio a ingagwe chimachi widukwado masanungam ani wa ekido yano manungam. Nebe. Migo ingilchia giekado gida ganawini mago ingil awesin yok. Geget gigun yagima. Bimisajik, bimosajik, bimatagajik. Bimute chigae kaunje yang manungum chi ganaweni ma ko ingyo we do kawishna maito migos presentai indijigi kene me go Ricky DeFoe. So I just kind of wanted to start out in a way of using Ojibwe to sound out the first language that we have. As a people, I always want to acknowledge, but understand that using English for Indigenous peoples is a task and a challenge, even if it's our first language, because of the limitations imposed by using English. We recognize that it's a foreign language, it's an immigrant language. So we have some challenges ahead of us, not only in that context, but also in the way of the worldviews that come with the language and other things that worldviews, ideas, and assumptions, and those things. I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous cosmology, philosophy a little bit, some of our values, and particularly maybe hit a little bit later on some of the challenges that we faced as a people, as not only as Anishinaabe, but also as a community with others in the homelands here. We acknowledge also the great Dakota Nation and the Cree, the Assiniboine nations that were here before us as Ojibwe peoples. So we have a holistic view of the world. And I think therein lies the answer, because you and I have been born into a world that is, everything is already in its place. Everything, even the life outcomes are in place already. We've been born into this. We have no say over this. Even the way we are identified as a people have been imposed upon us. So oftentimes we have troubles with that when we see ourselves through the eyes of the other, and how they see us is problematic. And a quick way of that, my last name DeFoe, French, Fond du Lac, French, Duluth, French words. They didn't say you're a little French boy, they say you're an Indian boy, and then all the stereotypes and things come out in the way one is treated with those things. So those are things that are imposed upon us, much like the conditions and social forces that are at work in you and I's daily lives to socialize us, to indoctrinate us into a worldview that is problematic. And we see the effects of that, the conflicts, the fighting, the much of the difficulty that we have, particularly in the estuary and in the waterways here, because of a root paradigm that you and I have been inculcated into, indoctrinated, day in, day out. We've been told these things. We started with the papal bulls back in the 14th century, 13th century, and into the 15th century, where war was declared on all non-Christian peoples. I did grow up in Duluth in the hillside for a part of my life, and was raised as a Catholic there. So I have some teachings there, and it helps in those regards. But and then the Indigenous peoples were seen as a second, were subhuman, and could not own no lands, was only could occupy, be one of the fauna, if you will, along with the flora. So those things were imposed upon us. These conditions that we have to survive through were imposed upon us as a people, the way we're seen by others. But we've always held true to our teachings, our oral traditions, which are much more important to us than written history, because written history has some huge problems with it and limitations. And so even now they talk about the tree rings and things that or give credence to what the oral history has told us for such a long time about the importance of traditional ways of burning, for example, in the forests and stuff. So this is nature's way of telling us that this oral tradition and these have some very important things to behold. So we think about those on that line as we go along it. and we go into the future. A cosmology is a way of being in balance and being in harmony with all around us. You know, we talk about Chimanitu Oki, the great mystery, where there's a great mystery abide. Here now amongst us, even through these airwaves here, there's cyberspace, perhaps. And then we get a little closer and we can see the star world. And then we come down from the star world where we have much legends and stories and teachings about the star world. And then it comes closer to us and we see the sun and the moon. These are determined the seasons that we're in. So, and then we come to our Mother Earth. And on our Mother Earth, there's orders of things. And we first was the rock nation. And Indigenous peoples say that the rocks are alive. We call those grandfathers and grandmothers. They were here the longest. They bring that stability. We also find in line that was here is the seedlings, the grasses, and the bushes and the trees, and they bring the oxygen for life. And then next is placed here with the animals and all the flyers, the walkers, the crawlers, the swimmers, and they bring the brotherhood to Anishinaabe. And then original man was placed here. Our language says Anishinaabe. So we were placed here, lowered here in this place. Nowhere in our oral traditions tells us that we come across the Bering Strait. So we have those in epistemology, a way of knowing through oral traditions. And we also have a way of being in ontology, which is we were lowered here, we were put here. So these are things that we hold dear to, these legends, these philosophies. We live by natural law and spiritual law. Natural law is any lines of demarcation. For example, the winds will cross unheeded, the clouds, the smoke, the winds, the animals cross back and forth. The waterways go across unheeded. And this is natural law. And this brings healthy to Ojibwe people. And so, and we also live by spiritual law, being kind to one another and caring and loving. And these brings happiness to us. When man-made law comes, that's when the oppression follows. So those are some of the challenges that we face is these man-made laws. Where are these practices, these policies coming from, and who is writing them, and whose interests are they being written for? So we see that coming from a culture of corruption. And so this worldview that we adhere to, and our challenge is that the world we see is an upside down world. We live in the shadow of the real world. The real world is nature and culture. That's the actual world. The world that we're socialized into is this anthropocentric fantasy world of economic exchanges and entertainment. And that's really become first and foremost in our minds rather than the real world. So our challenge is to right side that world. And we have to see it for what it is. So we always say that as Indigenous peoples, we have responsibilities. And the responsibilities is to kinship. And who is our kinship? We know about the immediate families. We know about the how we can, the animals and the rock nation, the plant nation, the trees, and all of them can live without us, but we can't survive without them. So there's an interdependence there in our worldview, the way we see the world. We need them. So we have responsibility and obligations, and it's bound up in community. So the community that we have, as long as there's an indigenous community, we have responsibilities to this natural world. And that holds true to the things that we do wherever we go. We know that Lake Superior we call the Great Sea of the Ojibwe, Gechi Ojibwe Gaming. We know that Mother Earth is 70% water, and 97% of that water is salt water. We can't live on that. That leaves 3% fresh water. This fresh water, and 3% of the fresh water is 1% in the atmosphere, 1% is subsurface, groundwater, the other 1% is surface water. So of that surface water, that 1%, Lake Superior, the Great Sea of the Ojibwe, is 10%. So this is kind of contextualize what the importance of these estuaries are. Now we know the history of corporatocracy in the area and how the land is so polluted and the waterways, you can't eat the fish, you can't swim. There's no wild rice there. So these things, they say that they're going to give $1 billion. We divide that up into about 30 entities, and that's not very much money at all. But it'll be touted as a way of cleanup. We think that the worldview is a problem. The dominion over all things. You and I've, like I said, I was raised as a Catholic in Duluth. I heard a lot about the dominion over all things. That is a huge problem because we see how it plays out in the polluting of our waterways that are essential for life. Earth, wind, fire, and water are the 4 elements of life. So this water is critical, and we have we have to think about those things along those lines when we talk about life and death and how we see the world. So this, I kind of lost my track of thinking in my line of thought there, but I'll say this, that our oral tradition compels us to recenter ourselves. And when we find ourselves as Ojibwe people recentered into a world, so I'm going to read a little bit here. Ojibwe oral history compels us to recenter ourselves in the cosmos, both physically and spiritually. Based on the Anishinaabe creation story and subsequent migrations, we find ourselves at Nagachuanang, the place where the current stops or slows. It told us that we'd find food on the water. Wild rice was plentiful there at the time. So Nagachuanang became our center of the universe. Driven by a spiritual relationship with our Mother Earth, we continue to be intimately interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent with all of creation, particularly, as I said, the flyers, walkers, swimmers, and crawlers. A liminal place between, a threshold between 2 worlds, the supernatural and the natural. And as I said, we live by natural law and spiritual law. A land of plenty this was in the past. Moose, elk, deer all around. The buffalo was but a day's journey to the south. Waterfall was in abundance. Geese, ducks, partridge, fish of many kinds, walleye were bountiful in the river. The various trees of great importance to our way of life, the medicines, were all close by, and a bountiful supply of wild rice. This was our center of the universe, Nagachuanang. So we ask ourselves, what does indigenous mean? So it means not only original peoples with distinct languages, oral histories, and customs and traditions and sacred places, but very important is the kinship ties. And we talked about the kinship ties being with the people, the living, and the dead, a biology. along with the spirit world. This ties us to the land, the plants, the animals, and the water. So this kinship is what we're talking about when we see this. Even when we say that our mother Earth is the source of life rather than the resource, even those concepts in the beginning were problematic for the Europeans that came and was searching for wealth. When we talk about our relationship to our Mother Earth. So all of these things are interrelated through a collective genealogy because we come from the earth and we return to the earth. They say that we're the same elements as the stars. And again, this relationship guarantees obligations and by extensions, responsibilities. And it's a community-based responsibility to provide care and to nurture the spirit. As long as indigenous communities exist, so does our responsibility, a lasting obligation that binds both the individuals and communities over generations. So we have to protecting, accessing, and controlling indigenous cultural resources is necessary for the continuation of ancient ways of life, particularly our status as sovereign nations. So this is our worldview. And then again, we juxtapose that with that root paradigm that we've been indoctrinated into, again, with the dominion over all things, a hierarchy of life. We know this hierarchy of life is white man at the top, the black man at the bottom. We know that there is man at the top, women at the below. So all of these things play out as we go through life, and it plays out in our interactions. And then, of course, we have a male transcendent God. In our language, we don't say Chimanitu Anini or Chimanitu Kwe, the great mystery man, the great mystery woman. We don't know. I've asked that question of other scholars, the Judeo-Christian scholars, the Islamic scholars, the Jewish scholars, and other scholars, and they said by deference, they defer to the great mystery as a man. So I said, in that deference to the great mystery as a man, is that where the oppression comes to the women? And it kind of stops them in their tracks. So this root paradigm that we've been in, that's a barrier to our way of seeing the world as a collective. Our challenge is to change the collective consciousness of a people, you and I. That's the challenge. And so to decolonize our own minds and to understand and realize that we've been raced, R-A-C-E-D, we've been gendered. And so we have a huge problem with this indoctrination that we believe, and that is believe is a passive word, it's not active. So those things play out in the way we see another world, a barrier to collective change of the consciousness of a people is this white racial frame, a way of seeing oneself in America, and that is superior and the indigenous people are inferior. The indigenous populations of the planet control 22% of the land base, but 80% of the biodiversity is on that 22% of the land. So there's things that we call modernity and things is a problem, unlimited development. And so we have some huge problems in front of us. So again, another challenge we have is to re-spiritualize a de-spiritualized world view, especially. We know the problems, and I'm not here to talk disparagingly of the institutions of religion, but there is a difference between religion and spirituality. religion is organized, and there's a mediator that you go to commune with the mysteries. Spirituality, we're there in the midst of it. There's healing power in the estuary, and we need to find that. We need to continue to see and be there with those healing powers. All of the problems that we face is because of a disconnect. So when we're disconnected because of dominion over all things, we have no responsibility to these places. And that is a huge problem. These social forces that are barriers to a change in our worldview of seeing the importance of these waterways also comes in a way of our loyalties, our fealty to what groups, the worldviews we got, of course, opportunities we have. For instance, the great chain of being is a social force. The way we see from God, the angels, on down, all the way, man, all the way down. So it's a stratification of a hierarchy of life. And there's a problem with that. And because it manifests itself by the way we relate to each other and how we see one another. So there's a problem with those, the way we see each other because of those social forces that are at work. They play out in our institutions. The institution is supposed to stem from your cosmology. You've got your cosmology, you've got your philosophy that stems from that cosmology. You have your values that stem from that philosophy. And then you have your actions that follow those values. And those actions are your institutions. The white racial ideology manifests itself and impacts and influences these institutions that are religion, law enforcement, education, government, mass media, pop culture. All of these things are influenced by these social forces, and particularly this racial ideology. And so we have to speak truth to that. And that is some of the challenges that we have, some of the barriers to changing that collective consciousness of you and I and those around us that we have influence over, and particularly our children. They say when we begin a great work that we can't expect to do it all in the time that we're here, this short time that you and I are here. But we need to create a matrix of possibilities for the next generation. And there is the beauty of the struggle. Now, I think that the things like a mechanical fix this and that, and until they get to until the car is repaired, and the doctor's the same way. So it is with us, and so our children will pick up the things and learn from us. These are forms of knowledge, intergenerational knowledge. And then we have dream state knowledge, that when the one goes on vision quests in the estuarine area, Spirit Island, other places there, the Spirit Mountain. So dream state knowledge is a form of knowledge. We have ceremonial knowledge that goes along with that. And today we've got contemporary knowledge. It's strange that in the world of mass media and data, so much unlimited data at the fingertips, that we have a disinformed and ill-informed populace. There's a problem with that, and how does that play out in our lives when we believe something, but we don't critically think about it? So I think the estuary could be, again, return to that thing that is a liminal space, a threshold where you can release the past and have promise for the future. So I think, and I commend each of you for doing the work and the hard work and the science, along with the generational knowledge and things to bring forth some of the things that I think that Indigenous peoples and had as truths for a long time. And again, I think the record of the Mother Nature has the record written and to back up our oral traditions and histories. So I wanted to sound out a couple of those things about the worldviews and things that we have as a people. So again, I'm honored to be here, and I think that that's about what I've got to say for now, until we get some questions and answers to stimulate the dialogue. Thank you for listening to my words.
Miigwech, Ricky. As we go about our lives, we need to, as you said, right side the world. And I think the challenge for a lot of us is to be humble and to learn from those that kept this as a land of plenty, as you mentioned, for millennia. We can, yeah. I think I will invite everybody to turn your videos on if you'd like. And Andrea's just going to lead a discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. But we'd love to have a little back and forth with Ricky, and thank you again.
I didn't get a chance to read that. Could you read that question to me, please?
I will be hard pressed to pronounce what was shared by Mark McConnell here in the chat, but he sends a greeting to you, no doubt, and that there are some links in here for some of the work about the happening with the St. Louis River Alliance, with wild rice restoration, some event links, and so forth. Ricky, one of the things you mentioned early in your presentation was that English is a limited language, and certainly how we talk about things can frame our understanding. I was wondering if you had any examples of concepts or words that are not well translated in English and that express something that is getting at this worldview that we miss with English language.
Like, just for the thing that comes quickly to my mind is a sin, A-S-I-N, a sin is a stone, a rock. Now we know that in the mainstream worldview, that's inanimate. In our worldview, it's animate. So we go into ceremonies with Asanig, the grandfathers, the grandmothers. They've been here since the beginning. And so that's the animacy. In English, you have gender, male, female. In Ojibwe, you have the gender is animate and inanimate. So that's just a quick thing, the limitations. We have a huge problem when we try to fit English into Ojibwe. Or in as second language speakers, we think in English and then speak in Ojibwe. It's like putting a square in a round hole and forcing it in there. Another word that we can think about is apegish, A-P-E-G-I-S-H, apegish. That is to beg in the most humble fashion, the mysteries, to plead and invoke. And we do that for all peoples. And the elders say there's no words that compare. That's the closest you can get in English to that concept of when you're, and even the concept of Shwainim, pity. So when we think in English of pity, we think of, they're pitiful. But in our language, it's like, show love to them. You know, your kindness. That's where that spiritual law comes out. And I just kind of want to say hello to, I see John and Lynn Pegg. Good evening. And I want to say a little bit about Indigenous worldviews, because when we went to, Lynn and I and others, to Honduras, the women were the protectors of the waterways, the little girls. And that is, worldview is so in our lands here. And we know that the women are the life givers. The women care for the water, the men care for the fire. There's balance. So, and they talk of little people in Honduras, and we felt their presence there. So it is here. So again, the wars that are around the world are on indigenous peoples and the natural resources that are there. I think one of the concept of natural resources has a problem too, because it's used as a resource and not as a source of life. But reciprocity has played up. But I just wanted to say a few things about our trip to Honduras and the connections that we have as indigenous peoples there.
Thanks, Ricky. We do have some time for questions. If folks would like to unmute and ask any questions or type them into the chat, we welcome you to do that.
Actually, I guess I have a question for Ricky.
Yes.
You know, we talk about preserving 30% or 50% or something of the world. I was wondering if you could speak to the way that there's kind of this divergent view of making a national park and preserving it, and that's our nature. And then we go about our lives in a way that doesn't necessarily live in harmony with nature. And I feel like there's a huge disconnect there with kind of this idea of fencing off areas that are, quote, natural versus viewing it as you've sort of alluded to, but I thought maybe you could expand on more the indigenous view of living with the land and not necessarily looking at a percent that needs to be, quote, preserved.
Well, I think that plays out in colonialism, capitalism, racism, and patriarchy, because you've got 22% controlled by indigenous peoples, but 80% of the biodiversity. Now, these forest services, the forest, the national parks and things that are set aside, the 30% and things, they even have conditions imposed on the fish that we can only take so many fish and things. They're trying to manage the place. What we see with America and the Western way of thought is that their way of dealing with Mother Nature is to beat it into submission, much like they've done to marginalized peoples. So to preserve just a piece of that is being, in a sense, like is a huge disconnect to the rest of the world. So you just take a piece of that and set that aside as sacred, or So I think the concept of a liminal space plays out here, where where would they, so they want to continue with modernity to the cusp of falling off and extinguishing life as we know it, or they want to preserve a little piece of it. And we know now that even the parks are so full, you have to go a year ahead to get a reservation. The concept of that is, it has its good and bad. I think preservation is something. I did some work in Duluth. We talked about preserving Spirit Mountain. They had a strategic plan, and at the top was revenue, creating revenue, and at the very bottom was preserving and conserving the land base and revitalizing it. And I told them that that's upside down. You need to switch that and preserve and conserve and revitalize and replenish, and then everything else will fall in place. So again, I think it's that worldview that's upside down, the way they see these parks. Take a look at if you've ever been to Central Park in New York City, in that vast metropolis. But there's more to it, of course, but the extinction rate at, we talk about this anthropocentric fantasy world of economic exchanges in the society that we created in entertainment, and you have the animal world, and already we see the bears are struggling, underweight, no place, the land base that they have is. So here we have a worldview that is man-centric, and we think that's the whole cosmology, the whole universe is that way, and it's man-centric. And we've got some real problems with the way, and limitations on our mind, the way we think of the rest of the others. It's a form of othering. You distance yourself from responsibility from those. So,
Ricky, there are a few questions that have come in the chat, and so I'll just bring these up here in the order they've come in. The first is, how do you think the work being done on the river over the past few years is or isn't in tune with the Native philosophy?
Well, I think the work being done is a start. It's a recognition that there is damage done. Is it enough? It's never enough. When we see prevention in a change of way of doing business, those things haven't changed. So it's really, you're dealing with the symptoms of a dysfunctional society. So when you continue to deal with the symptoms, you're never getting to the causality of the problem. So this little bit of surface work that they're doing, this $1 billion that they're going to contribute into the future for difference between 30 different, 29, 30 different entities that's going to be studying and clean up and things, is not that much money when you think about the damages. So I think it's really something to assuage that guilt of the government officials that need to be called out, the ones that perpetuate the pollution, the agencies that continue to do those. state agencies. We know their names. They perpetuate pollution. They allow pollution. And when we ask ourselves, are we part of the problem or solution? I think even indigenous peoples that operate out of a white racial frame of a concept of whiteness, I think most mainstream white America gets offended when a person of color talks about whiteness. I just want to say that there's a difference between white bodies and the concept of whiteness. Now we say that the white bodies are not the problem. It's the whiteness where you have that the continuously the superiority and the modernity, the continuously Western way of thinking of developing unlimited, using the earth as the rape and pillage and plunder and as a resource rather than the source of life, constantly pollution and protecting those that pollute. But I think you can't swim there. You can't eat the fish. There's no more walrus there. And they've been cleaning it up for a while now. So again, that work that we got to continue to do is to put in place for the next generation that great work that we continue to start. We'll do our part. And then our children will see us do that and they'll learn from that. So, but it's recognition though. I see it kind of as a form of charity. So you give to the needy a bit. So you have an unjust society. Really, these are like pretentious manifestations of humanitarianism, where you give to the poor and things of this nature, these bits and pieces. So it is that they're giving back bits and pieces to Mother Nature. And I think it's a way of assuaging that guilt that comes from the government, people in those institutions that perpetuate pollution and damage to our life sources.
Ricky, do you have thoughts about the St. Louis River's new National Water Trail designation?
The Wabaseshi Kana is
the new designation that from the federal government creating the National Water Trail, the pathway through the estuary.
Well, anytime you get recognition of a place that is, but that's good, but also you bring the traffic with it. It's kind of like depreciation. The more folks coming and slamming your door and your car and your house and opening the windows, slamming them down, it depreciates the value of something. Something that is sacred and people hold sacred, you don't come and desecrate it and then clean it up and expect everything to be okay. That's not the way to do things. So the federal government is again trying to, and the state government, there are all forms of government that have been influenced by those social forces, that white racial ideology that are barriers to life play out. So I think they're playing out there in the federal level.
There's a question here too from John and Lynn asking about your thoughts on reparations and the land back movement.
Reparations and the land back, I think, because I think that's a good idea. The reparations, of course, is acknowledgement of harms done. Reparations are part of conciliation where you do action. It's not a form of reconciliation where you just kind of say, hey, we're going to start talking again, even though I damaged it. So for some next 100 years, we're going to start talking again. So reparations, land back, I think the indigenous people's concept of in relationship with the animals and our Mother Earth and all those four elements that make up life plays out wherever it's been done, has been a success. Grand Portage, out in Washington. Reparations is the big piece, though. You have so much in politics that, it's like they'll never admit they're wrong. And if you give reparations, they have given reparations to other ethnicities. I think the Japanese, after the internment and in the internment camps, and after about World War II, were given reparations. But since that time, for indigenous peoples, they can make land claims and get compensatory amounts that are pennies on the dollar, but you'll never get the land back. So when we talk about reparations, even when they had the mismanagement of funds in the Cobell lawsuit, billions and billions and billions of dollars were mismanaged and disappeared. Corruption took it, and they gave $1 billion to all 574 tribes that had been the fiduciary responsibility, the trust responsibilities was gone. So those are some of the barriers in the history that we have when it comes to reparations. But it's been a success when any of these lands that are not utilized and should be returned to indigenous peoples, because when we think about it, the land base is on clouded title. There's never been no wars fought over the land. It's been through treaties and the violations of those treaties. And I'm no lawyer, but they say as a concomitant to any abrogation of a contract, it resorts back to its original owner. So those things need to be looked at. I mean, so it's not too far-fetched by extension to think that these parks and these lands that are not used to be returned to indigenous peoples.
There've been a couple more comments in the chat here, but we're getting close on our time. So I'm going to take one more question here, Ricky, and that's, as we move through recognition of damage done and the great healing taking place that will continue over time, are we returning to what was, or is something new emerging?
There is folks that say that liminal space that we're at, but some will say there is no today or no tomorrow, only the past happening over and over again. But to have hope, you can't think that way. But the practicality of the way things are done today will put you in that mindset that the past is happening over and over again. I'd like to think it's anew. So we can envision a new world, a new society, a new way of relating to our Mother Earth, and particularly to each other in this local. So this estuary could be a model of relationships to the larger world, particularly Minnesota, particularly the United States. I think that the climate is right, not climate change, but the climate of working together and seeing that the direction that we're going, the trajectory that we're going is towards death, not life. So we really need to be talking about the urgency of this new way of seeing this a new world. And I hate to say new world because it sounds like a new world order, but it's a new consciousness. When we talk about changing that collective consciousness, it's a new consciousness of the people. So we no longer look at each other as the other. We look at each other as human, a species, and we need each other. And all this individualism and stuff needs to go away. We need each other. And so just to be aware of some of those things. But I think the possibilities are there. The hope is there. The future's there. And it's laid out for us. We just got to do the work. And I know you are doing your part. We'll continue to do our part here in the Indigenous community. So I want to thank you this evening for hearing my words and sharing this moment together here. Thank you.
Miigwech, Ricky, it means so much to have this time together. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. Please keep in touch. If you're not a member, please consider becoming a member. You'll be able to help support our work, wild rice restoration, piping plover habitat restoration, addressing the AOC, the area of concern. And it also gives you first access and discounts to some of our events. And please join us for our next Water Wednesdays, the fourth Wednesday of each month. April and May will be virtual, and then we will literally be on the water through June, July, and August with some guided trips on the estuary. It's a pleasure to share space with you all, and we hope you have a good night, and we'll see you on the water.
Iko amen, minoa. See you again, hopefully. Take care.
Good, Ricky.
Thank you, Libby. Good evening, everybody.